throughout all the services today, you will find a musical rendition of the psalm that I just read. You will find beautiful arrangements of these words that bring hope, of these words that bring courage, of these words that on the deepest level show us that we are connected to a God that loves us, to a God that knows us, to a God that's present with us. You see, we all want that. We all want that deep, real connection. We want to be known by someone. We want someone to know the details of our lives, but more importantly, sometimes we want someone who is present with us and who will walk with us. The psalmist begins, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." The psalmist is affirming God's presence and God's knowledge of us as a reality in our lives. John Ortberg shares a story in one of his books. He says that one night his wife pulled him into their bedroom and said, "We need to talk." He said she pulled out a list. She said it was just an index card. Whatever the case was, she began with these words, "When our marriage is at its best, I feel we share responsibilities." She goes on to say, "When our marriage is working well, I also feel we both know each other's lives. We know the details of one another's lives. I know the details of your life, and you know the details of mine." Much like Ortberg's relationship with his wife, our understanding of God is defined by a God who knows us and a God who is present with us. Rather than speaking in theological terms today, I want us to get away from the abstract descriptions of God and look at the real relational aspects of who God is. You see, God searches us and knows us. God knows who we are. God knows all about us, but He is also present with us. Now, we may use terms like omniscience and omnipresent to describe God, but these terms describe an abstract being, not the being that the psalmist is describing. For you see, the psalmist says that God is acquainted with all my ways, and God's hand shall lead me. You see, we are invited by the psalmist to an awareness of God's presence in our everyday aspects of our lives. He knows us and He is present with us. The psalmist talks about a God who is with us when we sit down and when we rise, of a God knowing our thoughts, a God who is acquainted with all that we do. And that's where we'll begin. A God who knows us, a God who is acquainted with us, acquainted with all our ways. In the movie Good Will Hunting, we meet a janitor at MIT, Will Hunting. He is played by Matt Damon. Will has a gift for math and chemistry that can take him light years beyond his present setting, light years beyond his blue-collar roots. But he doesn't realize his potential. He doesn't realize and can't even imagine leaving his childhood neighborhood, leaving his construction job, and leaving his best friend. To complicate matters, 3 individuals enter his life. One is the professor at MIT who discovers this gift of Will's, and he's envious of Will's gifts. But he also meets an empathetic shrink who begins to work with him and change his life. But it wouldn't be a good movie without a girl. And he meets a young pre-med student who shows Will for the first time the possibility of love. When Will finally agrees to meet with Sean, the psychologist, he does so to stay out of jail. He does so to stay out of trouble with his then girlfriend. The psychologist, Sean, is played by Robin Williams. Sean is the therapist that will change Will's life. Sean is the therapist that will transform this troubled young man into a young man who can look forward into his future. You see, through the counseling sessions, Will comes face to face with a brutal past of abuse. He must also come to terms with the blows that life has dealt him and with the questions that lie in the future. There's a powerful scene at the end of the movie, or towards the end of the movie. Sean has been working with Will He's heard his stories. He's talked with him. He's gotten to know him. And he holds up a file and he throws it down on the table and says, "It's not your fault." Will remains unfazed. Sean says again, "It's not your fault." You begin to see a change in Will. Sean says it again, "It's not your fault." And at that point, Will becomes a little angry and says, "Not you too, Sean. Not you too." And then Sean again goes, "It's not your fault." And it's at that point that Will breaks down and in a release begins to sob. It's at that point that he has allowed himself to become known by someone else. It's at that point that he has allowed himself to be released from his past and empowered to go into the future. You see, that's all that God's knowledge really does for us. God knows us because he is here with us. He's acquainted with our ways, and because he knows us, we are set free and empowered to live as ones known by God and loved by God. God knows us and God knows what we've done, but God is also present with us. Hear the words of the psalmist. "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day, for darkness is as light to you." The great American civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., was a tremendous person of courage. He was threatened, he was beaten, he was vilified, he was imprisoned. His house was firebombed, and eventually he was assassinated. So you might ask the question, what kept him going? What kept this 26-year-old man appointed as the civil rights leader of the civil rights campaign in Montgomery, Alabama? Apart from terrifying threats of the Ku Klux Klan, King was harassed by police. He was arrested for going 5 miles over the speed limit, and that became his first jail stint. The night after his release, he was sitting at the table at home, received a phone call. The caller was slinging racial slurs through the phone. Told him that if he didn't get out of town, his house would be bombed. King became unnerved, for you see, his little girl was sleeping in another room. His wife was asleep on the couch. He began to think about that little girl and think about his wife, and thought, in a minute, I could lose it all. He became very afraid. And as he sat at that table with a cup of coffee, he began to pray. He realized that religion must become more than just words. It must become a way of life. He said he got weak. He began to struggle with this mission that he had been given. He had begun to struggle with this ideal that he was preaching about and proclaiming. And he said all of a sudden, over this cup of coffee, he said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I am weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage." And he said at that moment, he began to hear these words. "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth." Then he heard the words of Jesus. "And lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world." He said, "I heard that voice of Jesus telling me to still fight on." He said, "I heard that voice of Jesus telling me and promising me that I would never be alone. No, never alone. That God would never leave me alone." 3 nights after that menacing phone call, the threats from that phone call came true. A bomb went off in the veranda of the King home. No one was injured. The king reflected on that night, on those words that he had heard, and he said, my religious experience a few nights before had given me strength to face it. And I believe it gave him strength to face not only that one particular incident, but every incident that he faced along the way, even the assassination. For you see, that night before he was assassinated, he gave a sermon with the phrase, I've been to the mountaintop. Some say he preached himself to heaven. You see, at that moment in his life, I believe he became more acutely aware of God's presence in his life that nothing, not even death, could sway his conviction that what he was doing was standing up for justice, standing up for righteousness. I think it's fitting, though, that we begin to look at these last few words of the psalmist following this story of Martin Luther King. For you see, the psalmist at this point is given a litany of God's presence and God's knowledge. That there's nowhere that we can go that God doesn't know us. There's nowhere that we can go that God isn't present with us. But then he uses these words, or he says these words. He says, oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me. Those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. And then he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there's any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. You see, the psalmist's plea in verse 19 isn't this vindictive phrase that we think of. Ultimately, what the psalmist is doing at this point, after acknowledging that God knows him and acknowledging that God is present with him, he is just saying, God, make things right. In the midst of a struggle that he was facing, the psalmist just asks, pleads, and says, God, in this world, in this place, make things right. And then I love the last words. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Isn't it interesting that he begins the psalm, begins the chapter, and he says, I have been searched. I have been known by God. And yet his ending words are, search me, O God, and know my heart. Search me, O God, and know my heart. You see, as much as we've been searched, and as much as we are known by God, we are invited to continually seek God's loving nudge to be led in the way everlasting. We are invited to be a part of God making things right in the world. We are invited to have the courage of a Martin Luther King Jr., to stand up for justice, to stand up for righteousness. We are invited to be known by God and to allow God's presence to be with us, to rest in God's presence continually as we seek to be his disciples. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.